Have you ever wondered what happens when a bridesmaid decides to go rogue? Well, this is the story of a wedding that was almost completely derailed by one person's pretty vicious campaign of sabotage. And it's also the story of the protective older sister who decided she'd had enough and became what she called a butch fairy godmother to save the day. So let's meet our villain, Janet. This is the first shot she fired. In front of the bride's older sister and maid of honor, Elara, Janet says this: if she was getting married, she would be sure that her bridesmaids were thin, young, and pretty. Just wow. A comment aimed squarely at Elara, and honestly, it was pretty much a declaration of war.
All right, let's lay out the key players in this drama. First, you've got the bride, Maya. She's 25, described as soft-hearted and, importantly, prone to anxiety. Then there's her maid of honor, Elara. She's 35, and she is fiercely protective of her little sister. And rounding out our trio is the rogue bridesmaid, Janet, who's 25 and described by those who know her as simply rude and selfish.
So, a bridesmaid gone rogue. And this wasn't just petty drama. This was a full-on campaign of psychological warfare, which should have been a really happy, pretty low-key wedding celebration for Maya, started to turn into this escalating series of attacks, all designed to undermine her. You can actually track Janet's escalating sabotage. It starts with the insult, that thin, young, and pretty comment. Then it moves to the shower deception. Here, she actually convinces another bridesmaid that the bridal shower is family only, just to keep her from coming. And then comes the bachelorette betrayal, where she flat out lies about the party's date and location just to make sure the maid of honor, Elara, is excluded.
But this was the final straw. Just 3 weeks before the wedding, Janet starts relentlessly messaging the bride, Maya, criticizing every single choice. She called the music cheesy. She complained there wasn't a limo. This constant barrage of negativity sent the already anxious bride into a total tailspin.
And that's when the sister takes control. This is what she calls the rise of the butch fairy godmother. Elara saw her sister's happiness just circling the drain, so she decided to stop trying to just keep the peace, and instead she decided to take complete control of the situation. And you can see why. When Elara steps in, she finds her sister Maya was just a crying mess. She was completely breaking down, second-guessing her entire wedding. Every choice she'd made, she now thought was wrong, all because of Janet's psychological campaign. It was working. And this is the moment. This is the turning point. Elara just says, generations of passive-aggressive people have led up to this. You don't fuck with my family. That was it. She wasn't just a big sister anymore. In her own words, she was now an avenging angel. And the takeover was swift. I mean, check out these steps. 1, she takes her sister's phone. 2, she texts Janet directly saying all decisions are final. 3, she informs Janet that from now on, all communication goes through her, the maid of honor. 4, she blocks Janet's number. And 5, blocked on all social media. A complete and total firewall was built in minutes. This brings us to Operation Wedding Shield. Now, the goal here wasn't just to kick Janet out of the wedding. The bride, Maya, actually didn't want that. No, this was something much smarter. This was about securing the perimeter. Elara was shifting from defense to offense, and she started methodically cutting off every possible path for future disruption. And here's how she started fortifying the defenses. First, she contacted all the vendors, the DJ, the florist, everyone, with one simple instruction. You are to ignore any communication from anyone except the bride and the maid of honor. Then she briefed the entire family, even her brother, who was a groomsman, so everyone was on the same page. And get this, she even told the entire sordid story to the pastor, who became a very important ally. Okay, so fast forward to a week before the wedding. Elara gets this text from Janet. What should I do with Christopher? We have 2 hours where I'll be busy with pictures, he will be alone. I mean, it sounds like a pretty reasonable question, right? A mom worried about her son during the wedding chaos. So Elara, naturally thinking Christopher is a little kid, gives some really practical, helpful advice. She texts back, I'm sure there are some cousins who would be happy to babysit. It would be wise to pack a bag of stuff if he was too young to entertain himself for 2 hours. You know, thinking like coloring books, some snacks, maybe an iPad. And here is the big reveal. So, who did Elara think Christopher was? Janet's young child. But who was Christopher actually? He was Janet's adult boyfriend. Elara had just completely by accident advised Janet to pack a bag of toys and snacks for her full-grown boyfriend. As you might imagine, Janet did not reply to that text.
So then we get to the rehearsal. Janet tries to make her big, dramatic entrance by showing up late, to make a scene. But instead of causing drama, she's met by the pastor. And in what was described as his best Professor Snape voice, he just looks down at her and says with pure ice, "You must be Janet. We thought you weren't coming." She was totally shut down.
And that brings us to the wedding day and the villain's defeat. Janet's final, pretty pathetic attempts at creating drama were just completely and utterly shut down, one by one. So, of course, Janet pulls a no-show for getting ready with the other bridesmaids. She finally decides to stroll into the bridal suite a full 3 hours late. But by then, the professional hairstylist and the makeup artist were long, long gone. And this is where we get some beautiful poetic justice. Remember Janet's original insult? She had complained that the braided hairstyles the bride chose were dykish. Well, what was the reality on the big day? With no stylist available, she was forced to wear a sad, hastily tied ponytail while everyone else's hair looked absolutely stunning. But Elara had a few final masterstrokes up her sleeve. First, Janet's kind of tacky pyramid scheme jewelry was swapped out. Instead, the bride was glittering in gorgeous, rented vintage diamonds. And to protect this expensive necklace, a handsome security guard who looked like a male model was hired. Now, his official job was to protect the jewels, but his actual job? To keep Janet from getting anywhere near the bride and causing a scene. Genius.
So, completely defeated, Janet's last resort was to just pout like a petulant child during the wedding photos. But Elara was already a step ahead. She'd quietly asked the photographer beforehand to always place Janet at the very end of the row. Why? So it would be incredibly easy to just crop her out of the photos later. With absolutely no one left to manipulate and zero opportunities to create any drama, Janet's game was just over. She left the reception right after dinner, just quietly slipping out. And this, right here, is the ultimate blow, the final crushing defeat. No one noticed she was gone. The bride, the groom, their families, they were all so wrapped up in celebrating that her exit went completely unnoticed. She had worked so hard to be the center of attention, and in the end, she had made herself completely irrelevant. So what is the big takeaway from all this? Well, it's this strategy, securing the perimeter. It's a method where you don't necessarily have to remove a toxic threat from a situation. Instead, you just starve it of the oxygen it needs to survive, the attention, the control, until it's totally isolated and has no power left. And that really leaves us with one final question to think about, doesn't it? The whole reason this blew up was because at first, the sisters were just trying to avoid confrontation by keeping the peace. It makes you ask yourself, at what point does that stop working? When is keeping the peace no longer peaceful at all?